Welcome, friends. Welcome to another edition of Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul. I'm your host, Dr. David, the Cutting Edge Doc, and here on Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul, we do in-depth interviews with individuals that are doing cutting-edge work in the areas of healing or spirituality or social transformation. And I'm very excited about today's program. Some of you will be listening on the podcast, some of you will be viewing on YouTube. And welcome one and all. Today I'm going to be interviewing a new friend. I want to make sure I get her name right. It's a little unusual. Hang on. Emerald Peaceful Greenforest. And I met Emerald recently because one of the interests that I have these days, I would say it's more than an interest, it's a commitment. It's to resurrecting and empowering a fuller expression of the divine masculine energy in our culture. And this has been a real shift for me because for the last 30 or 40 years or so, I've focused most of my energy in this area to honoring the divine feminine and to being an advocate and a spokesperson for the importance of the true divine feminine energy waxing in our culture. And it's only been recently that I have felt that there's been a critical mass of accomplishment in that area, such that there's a possibility now of the divine masculine being able to come into fuller expression in a balanced, synergistic way. So I'm kind of entering into new territory here, both for me personally and also in terms of my my public life. And so I forget how I found out about Emerald, but I found out right away that she had a podcast called Men on Purpose. And for those of you who know me, you know how critical and how much I value the importance of conscious purpose. And so it was a no-brainer for me to want to take a deeper dive with Emerald. So I think it's particularly significant that the Men on Purpose podcast is being hosted by a woman. I think that is a groundbreaker. And so as I bring Emerald into the conversation, those of you who are familiar with this format know that one of the things that's a little different about this is that since it's an in-depth interview, instead of just going into the work, there's a lot of time in the beginning of the interview for my guest to purposefully tell his or her story so that we have an empowered listening about the work later. And also it helps you to emotionally bond with our guests. So with that, and without any further ado, let me turn it over for a while to Emerald. So take it away, Emerald.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, David. I deeply appreciate both the opportunity to serve and also to connect with you personally here in this format. It's really powerful. So I love what you presenced immediately in the introductory part there about how you have suddenly received a calling to start to shift in your focus to bringing a greater degree of attention and intention around the rising up of the sacred masculine. And I have had the exact same calling. So for the last decade or so, I was called into service in servicing women and helping them to feel great speaking and powerful, asking for money and finding their voice. And I was a part of kind of a rising tide of the divine feminine in the greater culture and around the world. And in the last 2 years, I became very clear that there was a shift afoot for me personally, as well as for the collective, in that it is now time to start to really make the space for the divine masculine to reveal itself more fully and more potently in service to the ultimate goal, in my mind, of creating a divine union that will really serve to support the evolution of the entire collective. So that being said, I'd love to have a really great conversation here together about what that's going to look like and how we can both collectively and individually serve into that. And so thank you so much for inviting me to be on the show. And also, I'm excited to have you on my Men on Purpose podcast.
I'm looking forward to that. So if, with your permission, I'd like to guide you backwards in time. And maybe you could tell a little bit about your story, about yourself as a person, and your journey in this lifetime that will help us to have a greater appreciation for who you are and your sort of the trajectory of your soul in this incarnation.
Sure, happy to do that. So I grew up in a household, kind of what you would call a typical middle-class household in a small town in New Hampshire. My dad was a car salesman, and he was also an alcoholic and a very violent and physically abusive and mentally and verbally abusive alcoholic. And I came up in a time and in a world where I actually became what I would call a masculinized female. So during the time that I was growing up and also kind of coming into the working world and so forth, I really took on that masculine energy because there was this cultural and collective expectation that women were going to bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never let him forget he's a man, which was this old commercial for this perfume. And there was these expectations that women in my generation were asked to attempt to embody. And so I started in a lot of masculine industries. I worked in real estate. I worked in the mortgage consulting business. I worked in the paving business. When I was 18 or 19 years old, I was in the paving business. So I spent a lot of time really immersed in very highly masculine environments and put on a lot of armor in order to be able to negotiate just being in that world. And I also spent a lot of time in the real estate industry between my late 20s and into my late 30s. I was in the real estate industry with a partner / mentor / boss who was sexually aggressive towards me for the entire time, like very predatory, very sexually aggressive towards me, and spent almost 20 years in like holding off that energy while at the same time working to produce income and to create a home and to be a good parent for my son. So when I came to the end of that career, I was the national chairperson for my trade association. This man and I partnered with another man to be building 51 single-family homes, 56 apartments, and an office building complex. And all in the middle of that, my son was about 3 years old, and he got sexually assaulted in daycare. So that was kind of a big wake-up call for me. Even his birth process was a pretty big wake-up call because he came in as an emergency C-section 6 weeks early, and there was lots of complications around that. And so having my son really started to initiate me into an awakening, a spiritual awakening, and a shift in my own level of consciousness. Up until that point, I was pretty much in the box, like really focused on doing the deal the way I thought I was supposed to do the deal, which was literally bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never let him forget he's a man. And, you know, had the house with the fence and the dog and the car and the garage and all of those, the things that we were conditioned to believe we were supposed to have. And then had these breaks in my life that occurred as a result of pretty extreme trauma with my child, and then my marriage fell apart. And during that whole time, I was in the throes also of a personal spiritual awakening. And as a result of that awakening, much changed in my life. And I feel like I was part of a cohort that was actually initiated and triggered by the September 11th event, because it all happened right around that time where he was assaulted in daycare. My marriage fell apart. I realized that I couldn't be doing the work that I was doing in the real estate industry anymore. And I went into a place where I needed to go in a completely different direction. And I began to open, and I had multiple repeated awakening experiences. The first being that I was in a meditation in a yoga class, at the end of a yoga class, where my third eye burst open and I started to see angelic beings going up and down a golden white staircase. And that was so far from the reality that I had been used to, but it was what I was experiencing. So that led to me stepping into becoming much more aware of energy. And I also began working with crystals. I began working with sound and became initiated in the Inca tradition, became a medicine bundle carrier in the Inca tradition. And during this whole time, I also had my own art gallery and healing art center. And all of these latent pieces of me started to burst out that I didn't know I had. My artist arrived, my author arrived, my healer arrived, like all of these pieces of myself that I didn't know existed. And then after that, I started to recognize that I needed to step into a leadership role to help others who were going through that kind of a transformation process, and to really become fearless in owning these parts of themselves that had lain dormant and saying yes to their calling. And so that led me into the online world, where I created a business that I served. I was heard by millions of people around the world, helping primarily women, although I did work with a few very wise men, and was really an integral part of that rising tide of women's empowerment. And so I did that for about 8 years. And during that time, I was also raising my son, who was going through a lot of stuff as he went through adolescence, became addicted to a variety of different drugs, and was engaged in criminal activities. And so there was lots of drama going on behind the scenes, while on the front end, I was serving, people all over the world. So there was a lot going on during that time. And that came to kind of a climax and a peak 2 years ago, when he actually got me down into the basement, locked me in the basement, and was on top of me, threatening to kill me and cut me up in little pieces, which that day I had done a land ceremony on every single piece of property that I had ever lived on, where I uprooted myself from the abuse dynamic with all the men that I had ever had any kind of connection to. And then I came home that night, and this experience happened where he literally kidnapped me and threatened to kill me. And thankfully, both of us transited through that. I was able to escape when he went upstairs, and I called the police, and he was taken to jail and had a period of cooling off. And he's now really wonderfully evolved from that, miraculously evolved from that. And so am I. And that during that transit, I also became very clear that it was time for me to start to look at and work with and face the sacred masculine, and to notice that throughout my entire life, I had been in relationship after relationship after relationship with masculine archetypes that were malevolent or malicious or mean, that were addicted, abusive, or that I felt alienated from. And I got very clear that I was the linking thread through all of those relationships. So that's when it became clear I needed to start to focus on looking for consciously men who are on purpose, who are doing wonderful, amazing things in the world, and to use my energy and my power and my attention and my intention to really spotlight and celebrate and highlight those men. And so out of that emerged the Men on Purpose podcast and my new body of work that I'm doing where I'm serving and being hired by men to help them to really become more aligned with their own divine masculine power.
Beautiful. I would imagine there's also a personal aspect in the sense that when you are around men that are rooted in the sacred masculine, it creates a space of safety and honor for you to rest in your feminine more easily, which is part of what you're doing.
Totally, totally. And for me, I've actually had to do a little bit of working with energy, like just really at the pure energetic level to anchor in the sacred masculine energetically so that I can relax more into my feminine. And as a result of doing the Men on Purpose podcast and really saying yes to this new calling that I have to start to elevate, celebrate, and spotlight men on purpose, it's like daily I relax a little bit more. Every day I just relax a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more into the feminine. And that is allowing me to, amplify all of the gifts of the feminine that are necessary for me to amplify. And I would say for me, it's been about bringing that marriage to bear internally. And now with the Men on Purpose podcast, I'm seeing the effects of that because I'm attracting and working with and going through healing every time I do an interview with a man on purpose. It's like, oh, what a wonderful healing experience that is for me to be in the presence of that energy. So it's now starting to materialize in form, in physical form, through the Men on Purpose that I'm interviewing. Yeah.
Another thing that came to me as you were telling your story that I think is a theme we can abstract as a principle or a key distinction is, as long as masculine energy is associated with violence, that there's no way that we can open the door to the higher reaches of the masculine, and that there is a distinction between the right use of power and violence. The different ways that I think men and women have unconsciously attempted to adapt to that confusion could fill volumes. It's like a metaphor I like to use is the menu. And so if life is like a restaurant and we come in and we are given a menu, there are very few people that are being in such a way where they're in touch with themselves deep enough that if they interact with the menu and there's nothing on the menu that resonates with them deeply, there are very few people that will initiate a conversation with the restaurant to see if it's possible to create something that's not on the menu. And it seems to me that the menu of masculine and feminine archetypes for the unconscious human on earth to be thrown into has been a pretty unsatisfying menu.
Very limited too, highly limited.
Highly limited. And I think that one of the keys to opening up to the divine or sacred masculine and feminine is to open up to the idea that as beings, conscious beings, we're not limited to the menu, but that part of breaking free from the menu is doing a pretty deep dive into the menu and our relationship to the menu. And I think the more conversations there are at that level, the better. And also, I think men have a particular challenge on top of all that, in the sense that a big part of the social conditioning for men is to gut it out by themselves.
Mm.
And women, I'm overgeneralizing, but women in general seem to be more natural networkers, and they have more of an emotional support system, whereas it's so rare for men that we right now have to have create a structure called men's support groups,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so unusual. And in the sense that a lot of this gets healed in the space of conscious conversation with other human beings with a loving heart, I think men have that added challenge in the sense that it doesn't fit their archetype to recognize their needs, their feelings, to ask for help. And so I have compassion for that, and I have compassion for that in an awareness sense, and I also have compassion for that as I reflect on my own life and see how historically my pattern has been to reach out for support to women more historically than to men. Now, some of that might be heightened by my astrological chart, in the sense that I have Venus trine my moon in the 10th house in Gemini. But I think it's more than just my personal astrological sign. I think I'm just beginning to let go of enough of my judgments about masculine energy that I'm just beginning to open up to being available to those kinds of male-to-male relationships.
Beautiful.
And I think the father wound is so ubiquitous in our culture, either by violence or by omission. My father wound was much more one of omission, in the sense that my father's mistress was his work, and he pretty much worked 6.5 days a week until I was past puberty, and he didn't do a lot of things that a lot of fathers do to bond with their sons. So organically, we didn't bond that much. Our connection was much more at an intellectual level. And so as I've explored my own relationship to masculine energy and have confronted the father wound in myself, and I can see how much of it for me it was omission, one of omission. But as a holistic doctor for the last 30 years, and having my practice be about 80% female, if I were to reflect back and someone were to ask me, what's the most shocking thing you discovered in your 30 plus years as a holistic doctor that you didn't expect when you were a young man going into private practice? Without a doubt, the thing that surprised me the most was the percentage of patients, female patients, who had significant sexual abuse. By far, I would have not believed you if you had told me that in the beginning. And so that goes back to the comment I was making earlier about this entanglement between masculine energy and violence. And also, it speaks to the distortion and limitation of the possibility of male-female sexuality and all the opportunities that can afford when it's in its proper place for healing and for growth and for sharing and for enlightenment. And my personal bias is that this is no accident. My personal bias is that this is very much by cultural engineering design, that this is all part of the divide and conquer cabal strategy, the depopulation control strategy, the don't trust anybody strategy. That's just my personal bias. I can't prove that, but it just fits right in with all the patterns.
Sure. Well, I'd like to speak to the violence piece. I think it's going to be a really important piece for us to dig into here. And, you know, one of the things that you said was about men being more isolated and not being connected and in any kind of communal, like the culture, the conditioning, the education system, the whole process of manning up, right, is essentially a process of disconnection from energy, from source, and in particular from sexual energy, which I feel like part of the reason why there's so much sexual abuse that you've probably seen over the 30 years in your practice that women have received is and part of the violence piece in my mind is that men have been conditioned to literally shut off every emotion other than anger and in some cases depression, right? So the violence it's almost like it's a natural next expected outcome if all you have access to emotionally, if all you're permitted to express emotionally is anger, then, and all the other emotions are not permitted, then, you know, where else is it going to be directed, right? Other than into violent actions. So for me, the way I see it is the work is even deeper than helping men to connect with one another. And I don't think it's a natural thing for women more so than it is for men. I'd like to blow up that cultural myth as well. I think that we've been acculturated to believe that women are more natural connectors. And I am going to call BS on that, because if you look at children before puberty, the boys and the girls are natural connectors. They're all natural connectors. And it was especially apparent to me when my son was going into puberty. Like one of the very first things that happened as he was coming into puberty, when we moved to a new house, he was coming home from school one day and some kid just randomly punched him in the solar plexus, literally just punched him right in the solar plexus. And that was the beginning of the cultural initiation into the archetype, the old, and what I'm going to say is dying archetype of what man is supposed to look like. So part of what I would invite the people who are listening and you and whoever is being impacted by this conversation to consider is, can we allow for the dissolution and the disintegration of this old archetype that is no longer in service and is in fact contributing towards violence, contributing towards sexual assault, contributing towards men dying exponentially more of heart attack and suicide, because literally they have nothing available to them in terms of their emotional range. And can we unlock that emotional range, which is really pure life force energy, and open up for them and make the space for them to have the full range available to them of emotional expression, so that a man can love another man and not be, you know, labeled as, oh, you must be gay, which, you know, if you are gay, if you are homosexual, great, that's wonderful. But even that label of homosexuality has been distorted and misused and has been utilized as a weapon to prod men who are not of that orientation into this man box that only feeds violence and more violence. So my invitation is, can we just completely dismantle and dissolve and disintegrate this old mythic map, what I call a mythic map, this old archetype that simply no longer serves, and create the spaces and the processes and the support and the environment for the true masculine, the sacred masculine, the divine masculine to absolutely, fully, and completely express itself uninhibited, unleashed. And that would include anger, but anger being expressed in ways that are non-violent, anger being expressed in ways that are using that fuel to create a change, using that fuel that anger offers to advance themselves, to evolve themselves, rather than using the fuel of anger and picking up the tool of violence as the only outlet for it. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense there, David.
It does make sense, and I've got two responses to that. One is that, and I want to say that this comes from having worked at really deep levels with lots of people for a long time, is that if you want to invite someone to let go of a dysfunctional archetype or system of thought, just the way the ego is structured and the way human consciousness is structured, unless the person has a sense of another possibility that is attractive to them and they believe may be possible, no matter how dysfunctional the old system is, they won't let go. And so I think part of it is speaking about and presencing this new possibility. I've had many women over the years say to me that one of the valuable things about knowing me has been to actually be in the presence of a heterosexual man who's pretty well balanced. Just being in the presence, like it cellularly tells that other person that it's possible. The other thought I had has to do with my opening remarks about the timing of all of this. And that is that this conversation we're having about the healing and the balanced expression of the sacred masculine, the timing of this, I think, has to do with what has happened over the last several decades with increased awareness and honoring of the sacred feminine. And that my experience is that the greatest catalyst for a man who's open to healing their relationship to masculinity is being in the presence of a woman who has healed her relationship with her femininity. And so at some point, this is why I'm so excited about your podcast and about this conversation, because this to me foreshadows a time in the future where the, shall we say, for lack of a better word, the men's movement, but I don't love that word, but I'll use it just for convenience, will reach a level of maturity where this type of cross-pollination can happen in a more powerful way. And I think we are, in this conversation, I think we're honoring our past, but we're laying new track. And I can envision in the future sort of energetically complex types of events where part of the time men are by themselves and women are by themselves, and part of the time there's a very conscious energetic and behavioral and linguistic blending that is done very consciously, very purposely in the beginning, very ritualistically, to interrupt any unconscious patterns of interaction. I sort of have a sense of where this could go.
Beautiful. I love that vision. That's a beautiful vision, David. And ideally, that vision can be extrapolated out to encompass the entire planetary family, because that's really my vision, is that we will come to a place where we honor ourselves regardless of gender. We honor our feminine, we honor our masculine, and we honor that divine union of both aspects. And out of that, what I see is really the possibility for the evolution, a huge evolutionary leap for the entire planetary family. And I love to use the analogy that what I desire to create is more than just 1 + 1 = 2. I'm interested in how can we make 1 + 1 = 11, right? How can we create that energetic, collaborative coming together that when it happens in the fullness of its possibility, the outcome is so exponentially beyond what would be expected by just bringing those two forces together that we almost can't, I can feel it, but I can't really clearly see what it's going to look like, if that makes sense. Yeah.
For sure. And I think a lot of the tools that already exist can be leveraged and recontextualized in service to what you're talking about. Like, for example, spiritually oriented depth psychologists know a lot about how to guide people through shadow work. And so a lot of that technology can be much more consciously applied to this issue. You know, like historically, a lot of those approaches have been applied to self-esteem issues, repressed emotions, post-traumatic stress things, but all of that could be applied to, at a deeper, more ontological level, could be applied to exploring the violence that we've inadvertently done to ourselves, the trauma that's inadvertently been done to ourselves just by being thrown into a culture with such a limited sexual menu.
Yeah.
You know, so what I'm saying is that a lot of what will actualize your vision already exists and just needs to be contextualized and repurposed. You know, I do a lot of ontological coaching, and ontology is the study of being. You know, what is being? What is being for human beings as opposed to being for a dog or a plant or a rock or an angel? And what is the possibility of being for human beings? And to inquire into what we've been being is a deep radical inquiry. And as you wind down to deconstructing the ego, as you wind down into recovering the nothingness, everythingness of that you are, as you deconstruct ego, as you really get down to the bottom of the barrel, one of the deepest identifications is not only yourself as an individual person, but yourself as a man or yourself as a woman. And so what I'm saying is that this deconstruction of the way we put ourselves together as men or women is a real deep dive. It has a sacred aspect to it. And I think we set people up for failure if we're not honest about that.
Well, I don't disagree with you. And at the same time, I actually hold the view that when we have created that collaborative 1 + 1 = 11 experience with a man and a woman, or a group and another group, or an energy and another energy, that there is latent potential there that can leapfrog and create a shift, an exponential shift in consciousness for the collective. When we reach a certain critical mass, shall I say, of people who have either done the work that they are kind of unified internally, personally, or have manifested this unification in relationship with other people, or in the bringing together of organizational structures or communities, that there comes a time where the energetic potential, the latent energetic potential, becomes activated, such that a shift can be made that literally shifts the entire morphogenetic field, kind of like the 100th monkey thing. So I'm personally feeling the desire to focus my energy and my work and my life force on bringing forward, using whatever tools are available, whether it's the ontological tools or shamanic tools or whatever tools are available, to precipitate the building of the energy that will allow for that leap in consciousness.
And I'm right with you there. All I'm saying is that when people engage in that journey of that deep dive, I'm saying it is a very deep dive.
Totally.
It is a very deep dive, and most people don't know that they don't know about that level of depth. And that therefore, those of us that midwife people along that journey, I think, need to have a profound respect for the fact that that's going to shake them up at a core level, and that sets in motion a process. And one of my pet peeves about spiritual guides is that there's a lot of spiritual guides that will shake people up, but then take a very laissez-faire approach to the process and take the point of view that, well, then it's up to the student. And yes, it's true. It's ultimately up to the student. And there's a lot that a good guide can do to make that way as smooth and as graceful as possible. And so I'm saying that I want part of the conversation around this, not necessarily with you and me right here, but the conversation around this whole possibility, to include a sensitivity to the fact that we are cracking open the ego construct at a very deep level here.
I totally agree with you, and that I also feel that it's really sacred work. There is no question that it's depth work, and there is no question in my mind that it must be attended to mindfully, so that the work is contained in a sacred way. And
Absolutely.
so that the work itself is, the way I see it is, it's really an initiatory rite of passage, and it is it's on the facilitator to be mindful of the impact of the rite of passage on the one hand, and the responsibility for creating that sacred space and for creating that container that allows for, to the degree possible, a highly impeccable journey for whoever is being worked with. And simultaneously, there must be the full awareness and knowing that the initiate also will in the deconstruction process be really required because of their own need for growth to do some things and to experience some things that can be incredibly earth-shattering. I mean, I definitely went through a variety of experiences myself, one of which was when I had a spontaneous Kundalini arising, and I called my teacher, my medicine teacher, back in 2004 or 5 timeframe. I had this huge Kundalini arising after going to the big island of Hawaii, and I called my medicine teacher, and I was like, I need your help. I need your help. And she couldn't hold the space for me. She could not. She said, burn some sage. And I was like, this is way more than sage, honey.
So you're saying you're pointing at what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
And so, to me, it goes back to the old saying in Buddhism about that, when the going gets tough, there's 3 places you can take refuge. You can take refuge in the Dharma, the teaching. You can take refuge in the Buddha, the living presence of the teaching in person, and the Sangha, the fellow travelers on the path. And so I think we're saying the same thing there.
Yeah. And in that case, for me personally, I had to take refuge in the teaching itself. Yeah. And during that experience, I even came to a point where I wanted to just throw out everything. Like I looked at all the tools and I said, how did I get here? And I wanted to throw out everything. And ultimately it was the teaching that allowed me to pull myself together again, because my teacher could not hold the space for me. And I had no companions in that moment who could hold the space for me. So it was literally the teaching itself that brought me through it and helped me to shift into a way of being that could contain that experience and allow it to feed my own evolution and growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With your permission, I'd like to shift gears in the conversation now to shift from, we've been talking kind of psycho-spiritually, and I'd like to shift gears to the physical world. And I want to talk about the assault on men hormonally, biochemically. And again, my personal bias is that this is completely by design to cull the population, to move toward a more unisexual vibe. But not only sperm counts are down in men, but testosterone levels are way down in men. And estrogenization is way up. And the toxicity levels obviously overload our liver, which influences our body's ability to clear out all this stuff. And so I want to put this on the map and say that I think a comprehensive study of this topic has to include the challenges that men are facing purely physically, biochemically, and hormonally.
Well, and if you're going to put that on the map, I'm going to add into that mix that they're facing challenges that are being that there's this whole philosophy and belief system and pattern of like medicate it that has created, in my mind, a cultural dysmorphia that causes people to reach for poison and is, I mean, I'm going to just use as an example, my son, when he was in school, when he was a child, they wanted to diagnose him with, ADHD and put him on Ritalin, you know what I mean? So I think that the assault is not just with the food system or any of those other things. I think that there's also this reaching for medication thing that is creating an opioid epidemic and all kinds of other physical manifestations of dis-ease and dysfunction, and leading to high death rates and suicide rates, and frankly, stimulates, in my mind, even more of the anger that leads to even more violence. And so it can become this dark vortex that just brings everything down even more. So
absolutely. I mean, we know from statistics, this is not fringe statistics, this is agreed upon science statistics. We know that young men that are put on Ritalin have a much, much higher percentage of criminal behavior later on than those that aren't. So I totally agree with you. The idea that we go for a drug as a first response is insane. Is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
The fact that young people are being given like about 100 vaccines now is completely insane. The treatment of the topsoil, the ubiquitous nature of plastics all around us, the EMF pollution, the fluoride in the water. I could go on and on and on and on. And I think that this is part of the war on humans. This is part of the war on health. This is part of the war on healthy men and women. And it needs to be looked at, and it needs to be looked at in this bigger context.
Sure. And I would like to just drop into the conversation and into the awareness of the audience that it's important. It's really, really important in my mind. And I'll just tie it back to my own experience, to be mindful about what we're choosing to focus on, because we could go down the rabbit hole of feeling just so overwhelmed by all the challenges that we become limp in the capacity to take action. And so I'm just going to, again, use myself as an example. One of the things that became clear to me a couple of years ago in this whole experience, this whole, what I'm going to call a rite of passage with my son, where he, in a drug-induced moment, and interestingly enough, he was high on homeopathic nasal spray, of all things. But because his physiology had been so damaged by all the variety of drugs that he had been consuming, including heroin and just everything you can imagine, cocaine, everything, and things you couldn't even imagine. Because he was so sensitized that even homeopathic nasal spray actually sent him into an enraged state, such that he was literally on top of me, threatening to kill me. And how I came out of that and turned into, really transformed myself and held the space for him to have miraculous transformation as well, was by becoming present in my own life to the fact that literally I had focused, all of my life had been with men who were either addicted, abusive, or I felt alienated from. And I just saw a whole life of relationship and experience after experience after experience after experience that was in my personal physical life, but also, everywhere I looked in the collective, it was also there. And we can extrapolate that into, the corporations and the government and all of those things. I could see it everywhere. And what became clear to me was I had to shift my own focus, to really consciously choose to say, okay, I've looked at that enough. What do I want instead to spend the rest of my life and my life force energy invested in? And that was what led me to consciously choose to start working on this Men on Purpose podcast and my process of celebrating and spotlighting and elevating what I believe is men who are involved in and engaged in and embodying their own purpose. Because I think if we focus too much in one direction, we can become out of balance. And so it's important to hold the possibility of where we can go and begin to fuel that to the best of our ability by choice.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. That's a very delicate balance. On one hand, you don't want to be in denial, but on the other hand, you don't want to indulge. And that's a fine line. And I think both the student and the teacher have to be very sensitive to that. You know, one of the technologies that I teach my students is something that I learned from Abraham, which is what he calls pivoting, where you use your increased awareness of what you don't want to heighten your intimacy with what you do want, and then focus on that and deepen on that. And that's a really valuable skill to develop, because it has a couple of benefits. One is you stop being scared of your own awareness because you know you can pivot on it. And also by pivoting on it, you put the law of attraction in your favor.
Absolutely.
Because now you're focusing on what resonates with your joy as opposed to the absence of it. So I'm a big proponent of pivoting, but I'm also a big proponent of not having your head in the sand.
I totally agree with that.
That's a very delicate balance. Just shifting the conversation again, is there any sort of best practices in your own life right now that you're really excited about that's helping you to keep your vibration as clear and high as possible?
I absolutely have some practices. Not only are they practices that I'm engaging in personally, but I actually use them with the men that I work with, and I call it the man plan. And it's simple. It's really simple. The man plan is super simple for anybody to utilize. But what I've found is the simpler that we can make it, the easier it is for people to engage and implement the process. So the man plan is 3 steps. The first is the M, and that's movement. So I think we spend so much time sitting and connected to our machines and become sedentary. We've become such a sedentary organisms, but our bodies were built to move. So I love to engage in movement. Personally, I love to dance. I love to hula hoop. I love to walk. I love to work with my men to get them moving, to just create some movement, whether it's physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. Like, how do we stimulate some movement? And it starts at the physical. I think when we start to move our bodies, we actually give ourselves the opportunity to unleash and transmute a lot of the trauma that we're holding in our physical bodies as a result of all of this conditioning. So the second letter, the A, is artistic expression. And that doesn't mean that you've got to paint the Mona Lisa, but to really open up, men in particular, and for me, this is part of my own practice, to our creative power, because it's that shutting off of the emotions also shuts off creativity, shuts off sexuality, and what's left is this anger and violence, right? So if we open up the space and create the permission and invite creative expression, whether it's dancing or making art or poetry or music or whatever, anything that really starts to stimulate the creative sexual energy is super, super powerful. And then the N in the man plan is nature time. And nature is, I can tell you right now, I know this in the core of my being, David, that what will bring all of us to wholeness faster than anything is truly immersing ourselves in our connection with the natural world. And whether that's spending time with a plant, or whether it's being outside by the ocean, or climbing in the mountains, or sitting under a tree, with presence, really communing in the natural world, the healing and the holing of who we are happens without us even having to think about it. So that's the man plan. So for me, it's movement, artistic expression, and nature time.
Great. One question I would like to ask you is, in terms of the amazing men that you've had the privilege of connecting with, are there any that particularly stand out for you, or like, do you have a hero? Just anything that can help us to get a sense of your vision of an authentic man.
Sure. Well, I've done a lot of interviews, and it would be unfair for me to choose only one. So I'm going to tell you the 3 top downloads that we've had so far were Max Marmer, who is the guy that I think you and I got connected through Max Marmer, who's a really powerful, amazing, multi-dimensional man. I mean, he does the things that I talk about: movement, artistic expression, and nature time. He spends a lot of time outdoors. He spends a lot of time dancing and moving. He does a lot of artistic and creative expression. And simultaneously, he's done multiple startups and created multiple millions of dollars. And so he really feels to me like a guy who is on a path of incredible self-awareness. He's a biohacker. He takes a supplement stacks every morning and in the midday and at night. He's just super, super, super self-aware and doing some amazing things in the world and working with people to help them to get more self-aware. His latest startup is a new self-awareness tool that he is working with some partners to bring out into the world. And so Max would be one who's a great example. Michael Chrostowski, who is the founder of the School for Men, is doing some amazing breakthrough work with men, primarily by using himself as an example and being the most unbelievable, miraculously, I don't want to say unbelievably, miraculously self-expressed men I know on the planet. He just...
How do you spell his last name?
Chrostowski is Hrostowski, but you can listen to him on episode 11 of the Men on Purpose podcast. So easy to find him. If you go to menonpurpose.com, you can get all the episodes that we've already produced and published, and sign up for more of the episodes. So Max Marmer was episode, I think he was 18. And Michael Chrostowski, he was episode 11. And both of those episodes are the highest downloads that we've received so far. So the 2 of them really stand out for me as what I would call the model of the evolving and becoming new masculine archetype or sacred masculine archetype. I really see both of them as being really at the front end of the embodiment of that in such powerful ways.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And you have a sense of what is on your cutting edge these days for yourself?
Well, what's on my cutting edge these days for myself is I actually just relocated to a studio loft space. So I'm activating more of my creative energy and working on a new piece of art right now. So that's exciting. And I've got a whole new environment to adventure out into in nature. And really, at this point, I am staying focused on my one thing, which is working with my Men on Purpose podcast and working with men who want to hire me to help them become even more powerfully attuned to and in alignment with their own unique divine purpose. So that's where I'm at right now, keeping it as simple as possible and having plenty of open space for conversations like this. And so I want to thank you, David, for the opportunity to be of service to you and to your community, and totally invite people to the menonpurposepodcast.com to just check out what we're offering there. And that will also give you access to the rest of my website. So if you are interested in working with me, you can find out more about what I've got going on there.
Well, thank you so much. You know, I'm just looking into the space and seeing what I moved to say in closing for myself. And one of the things that's present for me is that historically on my podcasts, when I've chosen a person or a topic, it's usually a topic that I have a pretty high level of knowledge and mastery with. And this is like a stretch for me. This is like, I feel vulnerable. I feel like a babe in the woods here. Like this has just been a committed field of study for me just in the last year or 18 months. And I feel like it's been a missing piece for me that I didn't know about. And that's a little frightening, but that's also very exciting. And so I'm proud of myself that I followed my desire to pursue this, even though I normally like to have my act together a little better in public. But you've been very gracious and kind. And I think there's value in people seeing me going through my toddler steps here in an undefended, unapologetic way. And it's like I'm so new at this, I don't have a lot of clear thoughts about what's next, but I do have a sense that that there will be a lot more for us and a lot more going down this road. Let me give you the final word. If there's anything you'd like to say in closing, and also to give out your name and your contact information again.
Sure, David. So my final word for you is bravo for your willingness to drop the armor of your mastery and permit yourself to be vulnerable and in beginner's mind and in that new undefended space. Thank you, thank you, thank you for not only experiencing that, but also vocalizing it for everyone, because I see you as a leader of a whole new cohort of men on purpose. And so in that role, in your own becoming as a sacred divine masculine archetype, this is a piece of it, that coming into that place of undefended vulnerability and being willing to articulate it is a huge, huge piece of the work. So yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Bravo, bravo, bravo. I deeply appreciate you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been some small part of your own evolving right here on the spot in this moment. Thank you. And yes, people can get in touch with me through the Men on Purpose podcast, or they can go to emeraldgreenforest.com. And actually, I'd love to give your community a gift. If you want to go to emeraldgreenforest.com/gift, GIFT, you'll find an 8-minute instant clarity meditation there. And that is for those of you who are in that kind of cloudy space of indecisiveness and confusion and just need a little anchoring in and support with becoming clear and being able to make a conscious decision to move yourself forward in the direction that you are being called to go.
So the URL for the podcast is menonpurpose.com.
Yeah, menonpurposepodcast.com.
Menonpurposepodcast.com. And it's available on iTunes and Stitcher.
Oh, it's available on iTunes. It's available on Stitcher. It's available on, I'll tell you where it's on, YouTube, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, Overcast, iHeartRadio. We're now on iHeartRadio, as well as Apple iTunes. So we're pretty much all over the place. You can find the Men on Purpose podcast, and you can also go to menonpurposepodcast.com, and there's a player right there on the site, and that's where all the episodes are also stored on the website.
What's the name of your YouTube channel?
I think it's Men on Purpose Podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Men on Purpose Podcast. I make sure that we put Men on Podcast after it because
right.
It's important for people to, it's the way that people will get to us. Men on Purpose Podcast.
So the YouTube version of this will be up within a couple days, and I'll let you know. The podcast will probably be a couple of weeks, and I'll let you know too. And feel free to use them, repurpose them in any way that you like. I appreciate it if you give proper credit, but use it any way that you like. And I'm glad to be a part of this. So just closing things out formally now. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been viewing or listening to another edition of Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul. I've been your host, Dr. David, the Cutting Edge Doc. And here on Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul, we do in-depth interviews with individuals that are doing cutting edge work in the areas of healing, spirituality, and social transformation. My special guest today has been Emerald Peaceful Greenforest. And we've been talking about the rise of the sacred masculine. And so with that, we'll close with love and peace. Bye for now.